Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you how to test and replace your EGR system components. Now your EGR is composed of an EGR valve, an EVP sensor, and an EVR solenoid. Now you will need a vacuum pump and an ohm meter to help you test these components. Now common symptoms of a failing EGR would be a check engine light, failing emissions, poor gas mileage, and occasionally stalling when you come to a stop. I will be showing you how to diagnose each and every single one of these components and replacing them as well. So let's get started. Now first we're going to test the EVR solenoid. Now this solenoid here controls the opening and the closing of the EGR. This bottom vacuum line here is manifold vacuum, and the green one is the one that routes to the EGR valve and opens and closes it. The computer controls this EVR solenoid and it closes and opens the EGR at will. So to test this, let's unplug it first and remove the vacuum lines. Now install your vacuum pump to the supply down here where the white intake vacuum would run, and then attempt to apply vacuum. Now this should not hold any vacuum at all when the engine is off. So that part of the valve is actually working. So next we're going to test the vacuum coming out of the intake. So next install your vacuum gauge into the vacuum supply line coming from the manifold. And now turn on your truck and check for vacuum. Alright, so you can see my supply vacuum coming from the intake manifold is good. It's right there at about 15 inches. And it's holding steady. So if your supply line is good, we can proceed to the next step. But if you don't have any vacuum or very low vacuum here, you need to replace the supply line going to the EVR. Next, measure the resistance between the two terminals. It should be between 20 and 70 ohms. Now this one seems pretty bad. So again, for this one you need 20 to 70 ohms, and this one's registering none, so this one's bad. Since this EVR tests bad, I'm going to replace it right now. So just remove these two nuts and remove your old EVR. Now install your new EVR and tighten it down. Plug the vacuum lines back in and plug in the electrical. We will be testing if the solenoid is opening and closing per what the ECM is requesting the EGR valve to be doing. So this green line here is going to the EGR valve, and that's where we're going to conduct this part of the test. So now to confirm our EVR solenoid is working perfectly, we're going to run the truck and get it up to normal operating temperature. Once it's there, we're going to plug in our vacuum gauge into the supply line coming from the EVR solenoid, and then we can confirm that the EVR solenoid is sending vacuum to the EGR. So let's get started on that. So now that we've confirmed the new EVR is good, we're going to continue with the repair. Next, we're going to check the EVP sensor and the EGR valve. Now the EVP sensor senses the position of the EGR valve and relates that information back to the PCM, so it can adjust the opening and the closing of the valve with the help of the EVR solenoid. So let's check this EVP sensor first. So first you're going to want to unplug your harness. Now turn the ignition on. Don't start the truck, just turn on the ignition. Now measure the voltage on the vehicle harness connector, on the ground, and the power. Now you should have anywhere between 4 to 6 volts. Now I have 5 volts, so that means my harness connector is good. Let's continue testing the EVP. Now let's measure the resistance of the EVP sensor. So measure between the signal and the power. And you should have no more than 5,000 ohms. I have about 3,500, so that checks out. And then measure it to ground. And you want no less than 100 ohms. I have about 550, so that checks out okay. Now pull the vacuum line off the EGR valve. This here is the green line coming from the EGR. Install your vacuum pump. And what you're going to want to do is pull vacuum on the EGR valve and measure the resistance of the signal. Now this number should change gradually. But I seem to be having another issue here. The EGR valve is not actually holding vacuum. As you can see, it's leaking right down. So here it is again. And it leaked right down. So I definitely have a bad EGR valve as it's not holding vacuum. The EVP sensor may be okay, but I am going to change them together as they are both 30 years old. So let's remove the EGR valve next. So first loosen the EGR pipe nut. Remove the EGR bracket. Remove your EGR bolts. And remove your EGR. Now you can see this original EGR valve is pretty spent. Even though this sensor here seemed to test just fine, I am going to replace it as a complete unit since these are about 30 years old. Now the EGR valve was actually leaking and not holding vacuum, and also there's a valve in here that should open and close with the vacuum, and that's frozen solid. You can see a lot of the carbon buildup in there, and over the years that'll just end up sticking and this valve itself won't even physically move. So this EGR is already well beyond its expiration date. So I'm going to set this one off to the side and we're going to assemble our new EGR valve next. So be sure to install this gasket on your EVP sensor. This is going to make the seal between the EVP sensor and the EGR valve itself. Also position the EVP sensor away from the vacuum port here. Since this can be installed in literally any direction, you might run into an issue when you go to install it on the truck. So make sure you face it the correct way and tighten it down. Now there's our new EGR assembly. I am going to test the vacuum just to make sure. Now you can see she's holding vacuum, so this is a good setup. Let's go install it. Now clean up the gasket surface area. Now make sure to install a new gasket on your EGR valve. If your EGR valve didn't come with one, make sure to purchase one locally. You need a new gasket every time you change these valves. So install your EGR valve. Install the bracket and tighten it down. Next, tighten down the EGR pipe. Connect the vacuum line and plug in your EVP. Alright guys, so the next step is to turn on the truck and let it run until normal operating temperature so we can test out all the new components. Once again, turn on the truck, get it up to operating temperature, and goose the throttle a little bit at a time, and you'll see that valve inside the EGR opening and closing. If that valve opens and closes, then all is good. Alright guys, she's sounding real good. If this video helped you, give me a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.